Hey, everybody. Welcome to this episode of SSI Tech Talk. I'm Evan Cormier.
And I'm Jean Claude, but most of you guys know me as JC.
And on this episode, we figured that we would talk about audio workflow and console routing. Before we go into that, JC, why don't you give us a little introduction for yourself?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm from Campbellton. Moved to Moncton a couple of years ago. I've been working as a engineer for around 3 years now. I also play a bit of music. That's kind of how I got into things. Yeah.
Yeah, as most of us have. No, that's cool. So I thought that today we'd talk about how we set up our consoles, how we route certain parts of our consoles, why we do it, and that sort of thing. Um, Maybe you can run us through how we approach setting up our input lists.
Yeah, absolutely. Um, it usually depends on the scenario, I guess. Depending on if we're doing a festival or if we're working directly with a band. Most of the times what we kind of like to do is keep our options open and prepare for any different scenario that we could come across. I have an example here. I'm going to switch over to Pro Tools. I have an example of a demo festival style patch,
Okay.
and I'll run you guys through what this is and how it works.
So what we're looking at right now is how the inputs lay out in a typical festival scenario where we would show up, not necessarily know who the bands are or what they require, but we'll, with this patch, try to facilitate everybody in every scenario.
Exactly. So what we have going on here, we'll start at the left and move our way back to the right afterwards.
Right.
So this here in blue is the drum kits. We usually like to keep ourselves two kick channels open, an inside mic and an outside mic. A lot of different engineers prefer different styles of mics when it comes to that, so having the option open is usually pretty useful. Then we do the same with the snares. We do a snare top and a snare bottom, hats, racks, floors, and overheads, which would be kind of like a standard drum kit. We don't really need most of the time anything more than that.
Right. And I guess a lot of the times in the festival scenario, we'll have usually one drum kit that kind of shares between all the artists.
True, yeah, that's right. That
Right.
usually keeps things a bit more simple. When we don't, we also have disconnect boxes where we can have different drum kits mic'd up on stage and have them set up, then switch between those boxes to change the inputs.
Right.
Next, we do the kind of the same thing with the bass. We leave ourselves two channels open, so a DI and a mic. Couple electric channels. We do four typically, because it gives you some options. You can either do two on stage left, two on stage right, or you can have two stereo amps, let's say.
So I
And
guess maybe
that,
we'll pause right there. So just to
yeah.
back up, so two kick drum channels, two snares, hi hat, rack tom, floor tom, or two racks, two overheads, a bass DI. So that would be coming either directly out of the bass head or out of a DI box from the guitar player, and
Yes.
then the bass mic would actually be miking the actual bass cabinet itself.
True. Yep. That's it.
Right. Okay. And then electric 1, 2 would be on stage, left or right. Electric 3, 4 would be on stage, the opposite side of stage.
Correct. I like this
Cool.
layout
All right.
because the way this is laid out, it splits very well into banks. So this would be from the drums all the way to the guitars would be my first bank on the console. So my first 16 channels. Then afterwards, on the second layer of 16 channels, what we kind of like to do is keep ourselves a bunch of lines open. We call them lines or DIs, or everyone has a different name for them.
Auxiliary inputs or that sort of thing.
True. That's for anything
Sort
that
of.
you can plug in directly, go directly to the console with.
Right. Whether it be a DI, a microphone, instrument cable, whatever the case may be.
That allows us to get ready for any kind of situation we can come across. When people show up with unexpected type instruments, sometimes it just makes more sense to throw them in there than to have a dedicated input for those.
Just for that thing.
We do 16 on those. because it helps us again with the layout of the console. It's one bank, so it fits very well. But we can also do 8 on the upstage edge, 8 on the downstage edge to have lots of options, but also not have to crisscross the stage with a bunch of cables.
Right. Yeah, that's a good point. Actually, that was certainly one topic that I wanted to bring up in terms of, making sure your stage is tidy of cables, making sure that the cables that are ran are labeled and either distinguished by colors or the channel itself. Because oftentimes when you run into, especially a festival situation where the turnaround times are really tight, having that ability to quickly change out something or to quickly resolve a problem should it arise, it's quite important.
Absolutely.
Cool. All right. So you've got 16 channels essentially of, sometimes I call them auxiliary lines. Oftentimes you and I especially, we refer to them as lines when communicating back and forth. So if there's ever a communication that needs to come up quick, you can say line 11, and I typically know that what we're both looking for is going to show up in a channel called line 11. So it makes for a quick exchange too verbally.
Yes.
Cool. All right. So then that takes care of 32 channels.
Yeah, that's it. So if we move on from there, so our typical patch is actually 40 channels, and we leave the last 8 for communications. So let's say from 33 to 40, we have vocals. So that'd be 8 channels of vocals. That usually allows us to accommodate for wherever vocal microphones could end up on stage. I typically, since I do a lot of monitors, I typically like to have a microphone per monitor position, or at least have a line ready. So if someone does show up unexpectedly, I can just throw the mic up, plug the line in, and I'm good to go. I already have a mix and a dedicated microphone for that wedge.
Right. I guess that's a good point too in terms of having, consistency in how we label things, one, but also keep things in banks of 8, kind of like what you had mentioned. Usually line 1 and vocal 1 and mix 1 line up at the same position as do mix 2, line 2, vocal 2, right? So everything's kept. It's very concise, I guess, how we move on.
Yes. I really like to keep things in order and always kind of follow that same workflow, same path. This layout also makes sense because it kind of follows what the standard input list would look like. So most engineers would be able to walk in if there is ever an issue. Let's say one of us gets sick or can't operate a show. Someone else could step in and easily understand what's actually going on the console.
Yeah. Yeah, it sort of makes for, like you said, a standard, right?
That's right.
Yeah.
And then later on, if we keep going a bit further at the end of this, we usually leave ourselves some channels for MCs. I didn't label the rest of this, but we usually do a couple different talkback channels so we can talk back to each other and communicate back and forth between side stage and front of house during an event. That helps us. What's that?
I was going to say communication. It's a big. It's a very important thing that a lot of people only realize they need it when they need it. And that sounds funny, but it's typically in the middle of a show when a line goes down, or when the MC mic's not working or is working and the MC's coming up and you need to talk to the front of house guy and there's several thousand people that are talking and screaming back and forth. You can't just quiet everybody down and ask what's going on. So what I mean is that oftentimes when that situation happens is when you realize, right, I know I don't have any way to communicate back and forth, right? So that's a good point.
Makes for a huge difference in the show as well when you're able to actually troubleshoot a problem like that and have it fixed without actually interrupting the flow of the event.
Yeah,
I mean, I can't even count the amount of times that we had to, fix some stuff on the fly and like change channels and, repatch stuff.
Yeah.
Still ended up being able to work it out because we had that communication system in place. Yeah,
exactly. This is a little bit off. We're going a little bit off on a beaten path here, but I think it's important to also sort of let people understand that oftentimes in our bigger scenarios, whether we're in an arena or an outside festival, we often have that stream or that line of communication be completely independent from any of the consoles that are going to be shared, I guess, maybe from audio guests and that sort of thing. And by that I mean,
That's true.
I try to have a couple of lines of copper run back and forth between you and I, between the monitors in front of house, so that regardless of, I guess engineer on my side being on the house desk, or if it's his file and he doesn't have our patching and that sort of thing, I'm completely independent from having to get into his workflow. I can talk to you and you can talk to me, same as a wired radio, if you will. So
Yes, that's right.
But that's maybe something we can set up in for a future episode. Maybe we can talk about sort of that communication and how we tackle that.
Yeah, sure. And maybe stage setup and all the equipment that we would use in a live scenario as well. That could be a cool episode if you guys are interested in that.
Yeah, exactly. And also, don't forget to subscribe. Don't forget to like, share, all that fun stuff. This is a different world for me. This is my first time being on anything like this. So
same here.
Apologies if this appears a little bit sluggish, but we'll get there.
It's all good. We were kind of talking about it earlier, and it's kind of weird being on this side of it compared to actually being behind the scenes.
Yeah, absolutely. We're meant to be. Yeah, we get into this line of work to be not seen.
That's right.
We try to get away from it and from the stage lights. So, but that's all right. We all need to come out of our comfort zones every once in a while.
Yeah. So that's pretty much how we'd like to set up, a festival, at least scenario, just to, have the options available and be able to prepare for stuff.
Yeah. I think it's a good segue into how we're going to proceed with this episode. I think that the running theme for us is going to be about making sure that everything's planned accordingly and making sure that there's room for error, or that there's room for, if errors do occur, that you have the ability to quickly solve it and quickly come up with a solution that you can keep the flow going. So I think that what I will do is I think I'll maybe start to dive into how I route the inside of my desk. And by that, I mean how my console flows from the input to the output.
Sure.
I think that'd be good. So I'm going to switch over to my console screen. You guys should see that.
Yep.
So I often get asked sort of how my audio console is set and what I do with once I get the inputs, once I get the input list and that sort of thing.
Mm-hmm.
So I just pulled up a show file from a show that I did. I think it was the end of February. That would make sense, right?
Okay.
Given the current circumstances, and I think it was the last show I did. So anyway, just to go off of what you had talked about, JC, we can see that I'm just going to bank through these audio channels. You should be able to see the channels highlighting. Then you see up top the label names. So kick in, kick out, snare top, snare bottom, hats, rack, floor, overhead. For this particular show, the band, it was the only act that was playing. So there was no other requirements for inputs. I knew exactly what I needed. I knew how many MCs I needed, DJs, that sort of thing. So I didn't necessarily pop the channels that they were giving me into my festival patch, which is like what you had just shared. But it's certainly, it's a modified version of that, but it certainly follows the same
workflow, right? Same structure, same kind of order to it.
It's the same, exactly. It's the same, I know where to find stuff. I might not have 10 channels of drum. I might only have 9, but I'm not scrounging around to find those channels, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's all about efficiency. So then I had 2 bass channels, a DI and a mic. I had 3 guitar channels, a keys channel, and then I threw a spare on the end. 2 reasons. One, because I wanted to put a spare there in case that keyboard player showed up with 2 separate keys where he needed 2 separate DIs. And the other reason, if I go down to the second bank, you can see that my 2 acoustics are in 17 and 18. So it didn't make sense for me to have to switch layers. I figured I would be riding these 2 acoustics, together, or having to access one or the other with my electrics.
Right.
And then after that, my vocals. Again, a spare channel on 24, because I don't know if somebody's going to want a different position, and all of a sudden she wants a different mic So it's leaving those variables, right?
For sure.
And then after that is specific to this podcast that we're talking about. So the first thing that I wanted to talk about was gain, fader resolution in terms of where your faders are at, and also how I get from that scenario out to the PA, out to my left and right. So I'm going to talk about input and how important having the right gain structure is. A lot of the times, and often these sorts of talks often end with a lot of the newer engineers that I see, but it's honestly a lot of the guys have been doing it for a few years, and a lot of the guys have been doing it for a long time. I see a running theme where there's just not any optimal gain coming in to the console. So they'll either have too much gain and their faders are barely off the infinity mark, or they'll have not enough gain at all and they're riding up to plus 10 all night on their fader, and there's no room to move, right? So the first thing that I want to show you and talk about is that if you look at my console layout, these are all the channels that were coming in. They're all, the common theme is that they're all in between -5 and +5. Okay. And basically, the reason that we strive to get up to that 0 point, I was here about making sure your faders are close to 0, is it's where the optimal resolution of that fader is. So for example, if you see these two, I'll select them here, these two faders, the difference in positions here at -5 and the position here at +5, that 10 dB difference has that much play in the faders, right? It's got that much movement. Yes. I can move them this amount of you know what I mean, of travel with 10 dB. Now, if I come down here from -30 to -20, that 10 dB, those little movements are going to be a lot more drastic in terms of how much dB you're actually manipulating. So that's why we always try. Sorry, say again, JC?
I was just saying it's a lot less precise that way in general compared to having it closer to 0.
Yeah, having them down here, exactly, your manipulations are going to just be a lot more drastic than with them up here, right? So with that, the problem with that is
so with having your faders,
yes. Yeah, the I don't want to say misconception, but what I've come to think I understand is that people sort of take that approach, which is great, but they tend to take that approach by putting the faders at 0 and then bringing in how much gain they feel is appropriate for the volume that they're getting. It's not necessarily the optimal gain for the channels that are coming in.
Or for the preamp itself, right?
Or for the preamp itself, right? So right off the bat, you don't necessarily have the best gain, optimal gain settings. Your signal to noise ratios might be off a little bit, and that sort of thing. So, so that's kind of the first thing that I try to preach. But the problem is, what happens in that scenario is that oftentimes it's hard to get both. It's hard to get optimal resolution at 0, good amount of gain, or the right amount of gain, or the consistent amount of gain, and have that be able to translate to a correct balance to the left and right. And I can show that.
Because even if it says it's at the same level, it doesn't necessarily, all the different sounds don't necessarily include the same frequency balance. And it kind of, like it might technically say it's at the same level, but still not work together the way that it's supposed to, right?
Exactly. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to switch back to my console view. I'm going to play some music here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start with the kick drum. I just brought 5 channels in from a track that I had recorded in February.
Okay.
And if we take a look at the gain here, I'm just going to press here. You should see that box show up. So the gain's coming in on the kick, on the snare, on the bass, on the guitar when he plays, and on the vocal when she sings. It'll be evident when they start the song again. But what I wanted to show was, if I start to bring this up, you should be able to hear that, right?
Yep.
Cool. So that's the kick drum, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's coming in on, you know what I mean, that where this console is 0, it's coming in at 0.
Yeah.
Snare. That's the bass. Okay. It's the guitar. So it sounds pretty, it sounds all over the place, right? Even though my gains are coming in at, you know what I mean, all the same gain. My faders are all at 0, and it's all going out left and right.
Mm-hmm.
So then people ask, you know, sort of, they kind of say, well, I tried that and it didn't really, it's hard to get the balance of both, right? So all of that to say, when I set my festival patch, if you will, or once I get my inputs done, I use subgroups. I use buses. Buses are subgroups. Sometimes auxiliaries they're called. It's just essentially another stream or another path of audio before the left and right.
Yeah.
Right. That's how I combat those issues of optimal gain, 0 resolution, and getting the correct volume, the correct balance going to your left and right. So what I do, switch back here. I should go to this page here. So what you can see is I've got a group for my KSH, which is kick, snare, and hats. Kick in, snare, top, snare, bottom, hi-hats. So those 4 channels come into a kick, snare, hats bus subgroup. The toms, tom 1, tom 2, come into another subgroup. Overheads, same with the 2 bass channels, all of the electrics, the 2 acoustic channels, and all of the vocals. So by breaking it out this way, I have the ability to bring in the right amount of gain. I've got the ability to set everything at 0, and I can then manipulate the volume without sacrificing the latter.
Right.
Does that make sense to you, JC?
Yeah. It gives you a second layer of control after, like in between technically your channel and then your master.
Right, exactly. And why don't I'm on this screen here, so why don't I just sort of unmute the channels for the mix that I had done. Like this is just basically sort of coming back into the desk.
Sure.
And I'll start unmuting. You kind of get an idea of where the balances lie. So right away you can hear that the bass isn't as aggressive, right?
Yeah.
But I'm still getting good gain, right?
Right. Awesome.
So that's sort of the first thing that I feel on my end when I started doing that, when I started moving towards that idea, is it really allowed me the flexibility to still hit compressors on the front end. So I still have the ability to hit, really gain into a compressor. I have the ability to ride a preamp a little bit hotter if I wanted to.
Okay.
All those factors kind of came in with optimal resolution, and I had the ability to control the overall volume of that through my subgroups, through my buses. It's been sort of the one thing I think that's allowed me the ultimate, like the most control, the ultimate way, the ultimate flexibility, I guess.
Right. Now,
Yeah.
I know a lot of people also like to do kind of the same concept, but with DCAs. Can you maybe explain like the difference between the two and why you would choose a group over a DCA?
Yeah, I can. It's pretty easy to understand if you think about it as um, there's audio passing through a group, same as like water flowing through a pipe. It's
Yes.
kind of going. There's a tee off of that, and a VCA. So a VCA is a voltage controlled amplifier, and actually, it's that term VCA is from the analog days. So they often refer to them now as DCA. So it's just a digital controlled,
Yes.
um, off of sort of that same concept. And what that does is it's effectively just changing the voltage in the faders. So it's just changing the voltage that's coming in through the faders. So the best way to look at it is if I've got a VCA, a master VCA, DCA, that's assigned to channels 1, 2, and 3, bringing that down or up is just like having three fingers bringing down your kick snare hats or whatever three channels on the faders.
So
it's just
So it would allow you to control the volume on all those channels, but you lose the processing side of it, right?
yeah, exactly. So the way that you can look at it, and this is a good segue to go into the next part that I can talk about. So because a VCA controls the faders, what it would do is control all of your post fader processing, meaning if you've ever, and again, this is console dependent, and sometimes even within the same console, they have different pick points. They have different ways that you can send the compressor in and out of the channels. But sometimes your compressor is post fader, so you want to push, you know what I mean? If you've got a compressor on a kick drum, you want to push that fader into the compression. Mm-hmm. So that's where VCAs would dictate that, right? Again, it's the same as having your hands on a fader. So what I do is I actually control my subgroups with my DCAs.
Okay.
So the reason why I do that is because if I have a drums VCA, right, which contain all 10 channels that we had talked about, all 10 drum channels, all those, if I push that VCA up, it's effectively like pushing all 10 channels into that kick snare hats group that I had talked about.
Yes.
It's effectively like pushing all those channels into the kick snare hats, toms, and overhead groups, right? So because those groups are processed with compressors and EQs, I don't want to push any more volume into that. Another good example is I've got an overall compressor on my vocal group. Mm-hmm. And by pushing a VCA, I don't want to push those. I don't want to get more compression on those vocals. I don't want it to sound squashed, right?
Right.
So rather than rather than having a VCA on the channels, I've got a VCAs on the groups. And what that does is it gives me an overall level without changes in tones.
Interesting.
So if I had more drums going into my three buses and they were started to compress more, I don't want that sound. I just want more volume. I just want a post compression, right? So that's why I always run my VCAs on my buses.
Awesome. I've actually never tried it that way, but I might do that next time.
Yeah, that's a Robert Scoville thing. The guy, he's okay. So for people that don't know, he's a product manager at Avid, but he's also a live front of house guy, and he's done Tom Petty for 25 years, Rush, Def Leppard, Matchbox 20. He's done a lot of arena artists, so he knows what he's talking about. Mm-hmm. And he shared that a couple of years ago, and I was like, combined with what I talked about earlier, getting the channels into those groups, and then combine that with having, basically 8 DCA faders that I've got ultimate control over. So I've got my drums, which is pushing just volume, guitars, you know what I mean, my vocal bus, all that sort of thing. Mm-hmm. It's been really cool. Yeah.
Awesome. Yeah, I mean, I'm a huge fan of groups myself, but I never thought about it with that aspect of it, being able to push, a channel back into the compression or, adjust it that way.
Yeah.
It's interesting.
Yeah. Now, if you're looking for a super advanced workflow, and this goes back to the Dave Rat days, mixing the Chili Peppers on an analog desk and an analog Midas. What he used to do is he used to have 2. So he'd have like a drums VCA, which controlled his drum channels, and then he'd have a VCA drums group VCA.
Okay.
So effectively, he could mix into compression. It's basically like having a threshold.
That's awesome.
If you think about it, right? So the more you push your groups and bring back, you're opening up the compressor. And if you smash the compressor with more channels but bring your group down, you're going to get that tone. So there's a lot of cool things, right? There's a lot of if you start thinking outside the box, it's very dangerous to go down that rabbit hole and get lost. You've got to approach this you got to understand it first, and you got to understand the purpose behind it before, you know what I mean? It's easy to get lost in it because there's a lot. But, and I think that this is a good way to bring it back. If you have templates like we had talked about with the festival patch, and if you're used to working in this workflow, if it's a 15 piece band or a 15 input band or a 40 input band, you're still following the same order of operations. So it's just a matter of getting used to having those be muscle memory, if you will.
Yep. It's all about getting to being able to do what you need to do as fast as possible.
Yeah, efficiency, like we said, right? That's going to be the running theme. So
that's it. If there's an issue, like a couple seconds can feel like forever during an event.
It's a lifetime. Yeah, it's a lifetime for sure. Yeah, I've been caught a few times, and it's not fun. So inputs into groups. Sometimes I don't need to use groups. Sometimes that's the other thing to talk about too, is that sometimes optimal gain and optimal resolution going to the PA with a bit of EQ sounds fine, and sometimes you can get away with that with you know what I mean, with a 16 input band or 20 input band or a 40 input band. Maybe it just works out that way, right? But this way here just gives me ultimate control if it doesn't. That's the only thing, right? So coming out of the groups, any inputs going into the groups, coming out of the groups would come to left and right. Basically I call it the master bus or the two bus or the main left and right, whatever you want to call it. You can see that over here. So everything is coming into left and right. Like I said, that could be channels as well. It's always all the groups, and it could be some channels. Out of the left and right, I send that left and right into a left and right matrix. I send it into a subs send. I send it into a fills send. And I also send it usually into the rest of my matrices. So there's two reasons why I have a redundant left and right bus going to a left and right matrix output. And let's just be clear on what a matrix is. Effectively, it's a mixer in amongst itself. So most audio consoles these days, I think, JC, you can correct me if I'm wrong, I think most of them have at least 2 or 3 matrices. I know the X32.
Most of them, yeah. X32 has 6, I believe.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And the SQ series has a couple. So anyway,
yeah,
I know that most modern, even the smaller analog ones like the Allen and Heath GL series, 2400, I think it's got a 4x8 matrix mixer on it. So
awesome.
Basically what it is it allows you to mix usually outputs into a matrix mixer. So you take a look at, this is matrix 1 over here, and if I collapse that and I go inside matrix 1, I see that there's 12 channels that look like they're ready to accept inputs with faders, right?
Yes.
So inside that left and right, I have my left and right bus, which is completely redundant and unnecessary. But I also have my vocal bus. So I don't always do that, but because I've got a compressor on my overall left and right, so that compresses everything that's going to the left and right, which is effectively everything, right?
Yeah.
But sometimes I don't want my vocal to affect that compressor. In fact, I want the other way. I want that compressor to affect everything but the vocals. So what's going to happen is once the band, gets to a certain threshold and I can squash them a little bit, my vocals won't be affected by that. Nice. So how I do that is I send my vocal subgroup. You'll remember looking at it. post fader into the matrix mixer. So that gives me a few more dB of headroom above the band that I know is always going to be there, regardless of the compression threshold or not, right?
Awesome.
So that's one reason why I have my left and right going out into a left and right into the PA. And this main left and right out is the main. That's the final. Like after that, it's direct out to my speakers.
Okay.
The other reason why I like to have my matrix outputs. The reason why I like to have my left and right on a matrix as well is sometimes just getting, and again, this speaks about the effectiveness of how you can, your fluidity and that sort of thing. Having my left and right available on a bank, all of my outputs in one section, if you will, because sometimes some consoles, your left and right is on one layer, and then you've got to dig in and throw your left and right down on a different matrix. This way here, I know that as soon as I hit the matrix layer, I've got my main PA, I've got my subs, which is, my sub send, a separate send for the subwoofers are going out, my front fills. And then the other reason why I send my left and right to the other matrices is for any other emergency situations we're talking about today, right?
Any possible
whether
output,
somebody comes to you, they want a recording, exactly. They want, somebody says, we need a satellite feed for the other room, or all of a sudden somebody says the cry room or the nursery, if you're in a house of worship, or, you know what I mean, underneath the mezzanine in arena. If anybody wants any kind of audio output, I can say, yep. Do you want a stereo? Do you want a mono? What do you want? You want 3-4 lines? I can patch those matrices for days.
Yep.
I can patch that one matrix to the same output. So if somebody needs 12 outputs for some reason, yep, it's going to be one left and right. Here's your 12 XLRs, right?
Yeah.
So I like to have the ability to supply the demand, supply the feeds when they're requested.
It's much easier to have them ready to go than to have to, be in the middle of a show and, figure out the routing and have to patch stuff and all of a sudden something's not working or that kind of stuff, right?
Exactly. It makes for a really convenient scenario when I can provide that, and I know that on my end there's not going to be any issues. You know what I mean? Oftentimes it's, are you sending anything yet? It's like I vow if the speakers are here, if you're hearing it through the speakers, then you're getting it and it's on your end. It's eliminating all the various, right? So
oh yeah, I like doing that as well. The amount of times I've had, requests for feeds in, first 5-10 minutes of an event, which are most of the time like the most crucial minutes. I mean, you got to be ready for that.
Yeah. And it kind of seems like that's the time when we get the request.
Yeah. Oh yeah. Always.
It's always usually 3 or 4 minutes into the event, or a few minutes after sound check when the rest of the crew is waiting for you to go eat. So it's nice to have them available. One last thing that I'm going to talk about in terms of my workflow that might also be a little bit intriguing is that I'll also set my VCA 16. So this particular console has 16 DCAs.
Okay.
My 16th one, I'll actually put that DCA on my left-right matrix, my sub matrix, and my fill matrix.
Okay.
And the reason why I started doing that is for anybody that runs separate subs, if you kill the left and right, which is usually the master on the right-hand side, you should get a bunch of low end. Then you got to go in and search for that. So I have my 16th DCA controlling every one of my noise outputs.
Okay.
So with one fader, you know what I mean, I can kill. And also I've noticed that 16th DCA, because I'm controlling a matrix, there's nothing going. It's past the point of anything coming in. So for example, if I push the left and right, it's going to push the compression and the EQ on the left, right, and subs send much the same as a group, right?
Yes.
I want the final output. So that 16th DCA, which is controlling the matrix outs, is like it's a pure volume. There's no tone changes. I'm not running into any compression or anything like that. So it's the final stage.
Awesome.
Yeah. Maybe you can talk about. I know we talked about. Well, we didn't talk about it, but I keep mentioning my separate subsend.
Hmm.
Maybe you can talk about how you work on your workflow.
I mean, I kind of like to do the same thing. I've never really set myself up with the matrices the way that you do, but that's mostly because I don't mix in as much large scale events as you do.
Right.
Most of the times, I do, I do a lot of bars, clubs, casino, pub, Tide and Bar, etc. And a lot of the times the PAs are already just straight left right. So most of
Yep.
the times I don't necessarily have that luxury to do that. Now, sometimes you
Mhm.
can go back into the processor and go change that stuff and get it manual. So what I would do is either set up a matrix on my left right, kind of the same way, but just have just have a separate subset, I guess. Um,
Mhm.
Now you said you do it on matrices. I also know that a lot of people like doing it on auxiliaries instead. Um,
Mhm.
like to mention that that's also another good way to do it. It's also a bit trickier, I find,
Mhm.
since you have to individually select and choose what you're going to be sending to it. Now, a matrix
Yeah.
would take the whole feed, so basically everything that's going to the master bus, while the auxiliary would take just what you send to it.
Yeah. And I guess a variation of that level as well, right? Since you can go from
That's right, yeah.
infinity to plus. Yeah.
In a way, it gives you a bit more control, I think.
Right.
But at the same time, again, it's a bit trickier and can cause you some issues if you don't pay too much attention.
Yeah. Yeah. That's a good point.
I usually like to
To
keep
touch.
my setup as simple as I can. Um,
Yeah.
I don't know. I
Like
like
you
making
said,
it.
efficiency, right?
Yeah, that's it.
Yeah. I'm going to touch on something that you had said about the sending your sub through an auxiliary and kind of having that variable level and that sort of thing.
Hmm.
The other advantage of having, and I've done this before, and this might be relevant to guys out there if they're doing systems tech work and that sort of thing. The other advantage that I had seen of running subs on a matrix is that with the matrix mixer, I have the ability to either send in a um, like a left and right or a subs in, for
Hmm.
example. So
I guess you could send like a sub auxiliary into that same matrix
that's right.
mixer, right? Yeah.
That's right, exactly. So for people that are wondering what we were just talked about, so in my main sub output, which is going out matrix 2, so matrix 1 left and right is stereo, matrix 2 is for my subs. In that matrix, I've got left and right, but I also have a feed here that's labeled Mon 16. So that's just an auxiliary. That's just a monitor auxiliary.
Okay.
And what that allows me to do is, for example, if I come back up and look at my kick drum, if I want to send it into monitor 16, that post send will come in to the matrix subs, right, as a source. So I can have my aux fed subs coming into the sub out, or if somebody just wants their left and right, they can come in, right? So I've done that before where some engineers have files where it's just like, no, I just want a left and right feed, and I've got to distribute it.
Okay.
I have to distribute it amongst my left and right, my subs and my front fills, because that's the control that we have.
Hmm.
I have the ability just to send his left and right, that two bus that he's sending me, into my matrix outputs, and it's unaffected by to him.
Hmm.
It's
Hmm.
basically he's mixing to the left and right, and he doesn't have to worry about sending an auxiliary to this sub send and that sort of thing. So again, it's all about having control, right? Having the options to present them when somebody asks. So
Absolutely.
yeah.
And I kind of take on that workflow a bit more when I do. So I do a lot of monitors, like I said earlier, on larger events. So when it comes to that, that's a totally separate, I guess, approach to it. So I wouldn't be
Let's go into that.
using. What's that?
Yeah, let's go into that. Let's go into some monitor mixing. Maybe you
Yeah,
can talk about that.
absolutely. So when it comes to
Cool.
monitors, I won't necessarily have the luxury to use groups at all because I need to use all my buses or auxiliaries for most of the times either monitors on stage or in-ears like I'm wearing at the moment. So I need to leave those open to be able to patch them to anywhere either on stage or etc. I kind of do the same with my matrices. I keep them open for example, a cue, so I'm able to listen back to, let's say, a mix that I'm setting to an artist. And also for talkback purposes, again, for communication between front of house and monitor world. When it comes
Okay.
to monitor mixing, I mean, my main goal is usually to focus on the artist a lot and try to have clear communication. That's really important to me, and to make sure that they're all comfortable on stage. The way I would do that, I mean, I could talk maybe about my workflow and how I would run a sound check to be able to proceed in that manner.
Well, that's actually probably a good point, JC, because that's a good segue. We can talk about how, because we share the same festival patch, like you had talked about, when it comes to sound check and when it comes to line check, you can talk about maybe about how that workflow makes sense and how we're both on the same page.
Yeah, that's right. So since we have exactly that kind of that same layout, same, I mean, for this example that Evan was showing, he was using a specific scene with a specific band, which is a different scenario. But when it would come to the festival style, where we do a bigger event, we'd have basically a mirror image on our consoles of the input lists at least. So I usually start on one end, work my way through, and Evan's able to follow along since like it's all in order, in the same order for him as it would be for me. So I would
Yeah, that
usually,
makes sense.
yeah,
Yeah.
I would usually start. We usually start with drums, um, just because it's like I said, it's the first on our input list. It makes sense to go from left to right all the time. And first step would be basically asking the artist if they could play the instrument. So in that case, can you play the kick? From there, I would have to send that channel into any monitor that would require it. If the artist wants to hear it, if they're closer, further from the drum kit, they might, need more or less depending on where they are. So I basically, instead of try to mix for, let's say, an audience where you're trying to create a good image, with good representation of the music to the crowd, I need to do that same process, but per artist. So everyone hears something different on stage.
Yeah, that makes sense. I guess you would want your guitar to be a little bit louder than the other person's guitar if you're playing, and vice, with your vocals and that sort of thing too,
Yeah,
right?
of course.
Yeah, no, that totally makes sense. Cool. I actually think maybe we can set it up next time. I've got a monitor file and a audio file that I could
Okay.
play, that I could actually probably bang through everybody's mix or whatever, and we can hear sort
That
of
could be
what a
pretty
person
cool.
would like to hear.
I mean, I feel like we could do a full episode on just monitors and stage setup by
Yeah,
itself. Again, if that's
yeah,
something that you viewers are interested in, we can definitely
yep.
maybe go into that a bit further next time.
Yeah, absolutely. Again, don't forget to write us, or to leave a comment, leave questions, whatever you guys want us to review. We kind of came up with this on we've got a few episode ideas, and we've got a bit of a how we wanted to structure. You know what I mean? We've got a bit of a vision, but at the end of the day, it's like whatever you guys want to hear, we'll talk about it. We'll bring people on and see where we can go with this thing. So
For sure, sure.
yeah, I
So
definitely got what I wanted to get out in terms of the console flow, how I
mhm.
how I work. You know what I mean? How I've got everything structured and how I get in and out. Um, we could do. I mean, I don't know how much benefit it's going to be, but we can go through my chain on what I do. I mean, what we listened to before as an audio example, that was no EQ, that was no processing, that was nothing. That was just simply gain coming into a console, my fader at 0, and my groups brought up to the appropriate level that mixed itself. That's all it was. There was no
That's right.
EQ. There's nothing. Everything was bypassed. So,
And I feel like that's an important step too, being able to start leveling things out even before you get into the processing.
yep. Yeah, and it kind of goes back to like not the old, but the recording ways of doing it. People often say clean it up first, and that's you're halfway there if you can clean it up. You know what I mean? Get rid of the bottom end and bring in the right volume, and bring the fader to where it needs to be, and you should be able to get there pretty quick with minimal, if everything else is set up right, with
Yeah.
minimal effort, if you will.
hmm of course, you're
thing
always
that,
kind of limited by what you get, from the artists themselves too. Sometimes, we're stuck in a situation where we can't actually control certain things or stage volume, etc.
Yep, yep, absolutely. Maybe I can do like a shameless plug or promotion and just kind of walk you through what I do per channel. And I won't go through. I'll go through it really quick. I won't, but I just kind of want to get an idea. I want to give you an idea of how we hear it, how we hear a channel, what I do, and you guys can judge for yourself the final outcome. Does that sound right?
Sure thing, yeah. I can maybe do
Cool.
a quick run through again of my workflow after that too, if you want.
Yep. Okay, let's do it, JC.
Sure.
So I'm just gonna play. Let me mute everything. Oh, that's right. Everything was muted from before. Okay. So I'm just gonna mute everything, and I'm just gonna bring everything in one at a time. Again, everything is bypassed for processing. So up here, you can see like all these plugins up there. Like they're all white. I guess I can't.
So white
Anyway, you see at the top, they're all white.
engaged.
Then anything
Yeah,
that's in the chain is blue. You can see it up on these two; they're blue.
So maybe
So what I'm
a
gonna
quick.
do-
I have maybe something I'd like to mention real quick before we get into the actual processing. One thing we
Okay.
didn't touch on is mute groups. I usually find that that's a really important part of my workflow, anyways, because it lets you group all your channels together and mute them all at a time, or do different configurations of that instead of having to do every single one of them independently.
Yeah, it's a really good point. I'm horrible at it. I'm really, really bad at using mute groups. It was just something that I never used a lot, I guess, maybe.
Right.
But it's something that I maybe should make it a point.
I actually use it quite a bit more when I do
to the
monitors
norm.
than when I would do front of house, actually.
Yeah,
So like having like a mute group set up where it's like all the inputs are muted, but communications are still passing through. One of them which
Yep.
is everything completely off, and then groups for like just drums or just guitars, etc.
So you've got an all, like you've got a mute group all type of thing.
Yeah.
You do that.
Yeah, again, maybe I
Yeah.
can show that with a console sometime. But yeah, I like to have a couple different. I think it's like three different like general groups that I use for like sound checks and all that kind of stuff.
Okay.
So yeah, one of them would be, I'd have to go through again and look at what I have. But yeah, one of them's like all the inputs off. One of them is all the inputs, but except for communications, so that our talkbacks are still active and all that.
Yep.
And yeah, I think that
Yeah, it's important too, for especially where you're running into a situation where we might not always know what's to come, or if there's a festival switch over, or if there's a change, all of a sudden you might be buried a couple of layers where you're not really sure what's happening. It's always nice to have a bit of a bailout, right?
yeah, for sure.
No, that's cool. All right, so
Cool.
let's go
All right.
back to. So this is kick in. I'm just going to hit play.
Sure.
You let me know if it's too loud, JC. If it starts to get too loud, you can pull
Oh,
it back.
looks good for now.
So I'm just going to start putting those in. So I've got a SSL. It's an emulation of an SSL
Mhm.
and a Max So again, like you notice, that's what it was. So I'm not afraid to make it a little more lively.
Yeah, oh yeah.
Snare. Snare bottom. I don't think there's anything done, just snare bottom. Hats. Again, it's on the stack. Rack tom. Floor tom. And the overheads. So that's the drum kit sound.
Okay.
Then we go into the group. Oh, I forgot to. kick snare hat group that I was talking about.
Right.
So it's just catching a little bit of the top end. It's just a little bit of the mid-range.
Okay.
Not sure if that's on purpose, to be honest. I think I might have done that yesterday when I was showing you the demonstrations of what the what that channel did. So
Now, I don't know if it's just what I'm hearing through the stream itself, but it sounds to me like your overheads are generally quite a bit lower on your drums when they're playing by themselves. I don't know if you do it this way, but I usually tend to keep them down until I have all my vocals up. And it's kind of one of the last things I bring in if I need to.
sorry, you cut off at the beginning. What is JC? The drums, you said?
I was talking about the overheads in the drum mix.
Yes. Yeah.
So-
yeah. No, that's a good point. It's funny because it's such a different world from mixing in the studio. I find that a lot of the studio videos that I watch, a lot of the tone and a lot of the sound that they go for is the room
Yes.
mics and the overheads, right? That's kind of like what their
Mhm.
drum kit sound is, and then they kind of add the direct sounds underneath that. We're oftentimes unable to do that. Like, it's just one of those things that, because
That's right.
our reality is that we're live, like we're on a live, you know what I mean? There's no rewind. We have the inability to bring up those things because it's just going to pick up bleed, right? It's just going to pick up a bunch of indirect noise. So yeah, that's a really good point.
Fighting bleed can be a bit of a pain sometimes, especially if you
Yeah.
have like a drummer that's very loud on the cymbals. That
Yep.
usually just comes out so much in the vocal mics.
Yeah.
I mean,
That's a
of
good
course, it
point.
depends on
It's-
the side of the stage as well. I mean, it's going to be
Yeah.
different in a small club compared to on a large outdoor stage.
Yeah. No, it's a really good point, JC, because it's one of those things that I learned quickly when I started doing this, that you can't, when it comes to live, you can't be afraid to do what you need to do to get your end results.
Yeah.
You know, I often hear the term like, oh, it doesn't look, you know, that EQ doesn't look right. And it's always one of those things that I hear it a lot and I say it a lot, and oftentimes it's usually warranted, but a lot of times people often will say, you know what I mean, it doesn't look right, and they're just, it doesn't matter. The reason why it doesn't sound good is because it needs to look bad, I guess. Like it's one of those things that, you know, if you can't use overheads, then don't turn them on. You know what I mean? You don't need them. So no, it's a really good point. Let me just run through this a little, you know, quickly, and then we can move on.
Yep.
We're at the bass. Bass guitar has this cool MV2. It pulls up the low end and it compresses it, so it expands it and compresses it at the same time.
Nice.
It's pretty handy for bass, I find, because a lot of the times with a bass guitar, you'll get the high, when you're playing the high notes on the fret, it'll be a lot lower in volume versus, you know what I mean, the lower notes. So to get a bass to sit right is often a matter of pulling those low volume notes up.
I tend to like brightening up basses a lot in general. I find myself doing it really often. Or like you said, taking down some of the low end. I like the clarity that it gives it, and sometimes it's a bit easier to understand what the notes actually are.
That's it. Yeah, the clarity of it. Yeah, that's what I've got. This is on the bass. This is on the bass mic.
Right.
Yeah, so I'm not afraid to get some of that clunkiness out of it.
No, for sure. Do you have a preference between mic and DI?
Between a what, sorry?
With bass mic and bass DI?
What I usually try to do is I usually try to get a lot of the low end out of a bass DI. I usually try to get the warmth out of a DI, and then I'll get clarity out of the mic. That's usually what I try to do. Now, it depends on the tone coming out of the cab, but most often the cabinet will offer me a lot more grit
Yes.
a lot more clarity. So yeah, I usually try to. I don't know if I did it with this particular one. We could take a look, but sometimes I'll, depending on the input. Yeah, I guess that one. Well, see that particular. She was looking. She didn't. She wanted the '70s, the 1970s. No low end bass tone, so it's a bit of a
Right.
bad example. But sometimes on my bass DI, what I'll do is I'll bring down. I might do something like this, right? Like bring down some of that high end, and lower the high pass down to 40 or 50 hertz type of thing. It's all about creating a pocket for all the instruments need to create a pocket for themselves, right? So you can't have a bass guitar share 40 or 50 hertz with a kick drum and expect it to come out. I mean, there's going to be some time differences, some time
Yes.
offsets, the propaganda effect where you're actually going to be playing a little bit later than the bass player and that sort of thing. So you got to make sure that you're creating pockets with within your frequency range. There's only so many frequencies. I mean, there's a lot of them, but a lot of instruments share a lot of the same frequency ranges, and it doesn't necessarily translate well when it comes out of one source, right?
Yeah, that's right. You could combat that a bit with some side chaining if you would want to,
Yeah, you
but
absolutely can.
but that's also
You
something
absolutely.
that, again, I mean, if you're not paying attention, it can be pretty easy to overdo it.
Yep. Just gonna plug all these back in, and I'm gonna talk about the some of the effects that I use. I think that's another thing that I utilize a lot, but I also sorry, can't do two things at once. There we go. I think that should be good. That's a couple of missed, but that's all right. So when it comes to effects, I find again what differs from studio work or what differs from hearing a live recording. Like if somebody were to record my left and right, they would probably get a lot of effects. Like it's not something that I'm easy on. But I also find that, and again, you got to be careful because you can definitely overdo it. That's one thing that I hear a lot too, is just too much saturation, too much space. But I find not enough space or not enough what reverb can portray as space or depth. Without it, it just kind of sounds like a dull sort of mix coming from two speakers, which sounds funny because that's what it is doing.
Yes.
But it doesn't sound like if you were to walk into a big, you know, amphitheater or somewhere where it was acoustically perfect, right? You got to kind of create that a little bit. Now, even in acoustically challenging spaces, there's still times where you almost have to match that reverb. Like if you've got a really wet room where the drums are just kind of all hollow and a really dry vocal, and again, it's very specific to your room, but there could be situations where you would want to almost, you know, not necessarily match it, but you kind of want to play that acoustical reverb to your advantage.
I
So
mean,
let me,
I guess it's important to try to make the music sound like it's in, a coherent kind of a space as well. If it
that's
sounds
it.
like one instrument is at a certain spot and the other sounds like it's, far in a tunnel somewhere, it doesn't
That's
make
it.
sense
It
when
doesn't,
you
yeah.
listen to it.
Yep, exactly. I'll give you. I'm just gonna play the drums a little bit. And I'm gonna bring in. I usually do two reverbs for the snare. I don't know if you do that or not, JC, but I
I
often, as part of my template, I often have a short and a long,
Yes, I like to
and
do
and
it
it
when
just
I.
creates.
Oh,
Yeah,
sorry.
it kind of gives me, depending on the tempo of the song too, right?
Yeah, I usually like to do it as well, but a lot of times I don't have necessarily that option. Um, so at venues like, let's say, the Casino Pub where it's an LS9, or uh, other venues where I would use a console like an X32, I'm usually pretty limited on the amount of effects I can use. So I have to pick and choose where I place them. I usually try to do one or two on drums, one on vocal, and then a delay. So I don't necessarily have that many options, but when I do, let's say, record to Pro Tools or something where I can choose as many buses as as I want, then yes, yeah, I'd like to do that too.
Yep, exactly. It it allows me to kind of push and pull the song a little bit based on what the song calls for.
Yes.
So maybe a little slower song, you're obviously going to want a little bit of a longer tail on the reverb as opposed to using that on a fast song where it's just going to get saturated and sort of just swirling around, if you will. So
one of the things I love,
you can hear the YouTube vocals. So that's the short verb. I'll exaggerate it.
Okay. Yep.
I usually put a bit of a pre-delay. So this one here, there's 43 milliseconds of pre-delay. I find it kind of gets it out of the way a little bit.
Yeah. Oh yeah. Lets your source, the natural source itself, still be heard the way it's supposed to.
See, it kind of saturates the snare, but if I bring it up, the pop of the snare comes back.
Yes.
Do it again. So yeah, hopefully you guys can hear me over the me over the music. What I was saying is that basically to get those transients, to get those pops to come from the snare drum, which is what I'm looking for, it doesn't saturate, it doesn't limit those transients, those snaps, those
doesn't blur the original sound out completely.
Yeah, it doesn't blur it out exactly. So I like to give a little bit of time to allow those transients to come through. And then the snare long. So that's the tail of it. That's like probably something that I would use specifically for an effect that I was looking for at a specific time. So whether or not somebody comes down, if there's a downbeat on the snare at the end of a song that I know is coming, and I just want that sort of to trail on.
Yeah.
But otherwise, it's pretty specific to when I would use it.
I kind of like using that effect in like either like build ups or like so really intense parts sometimes too, just to make it feel like that much larger, I guess.
It's a good point. Yeah, almost create like a pseudo acoustic scenario where it's kind of getting a little bit blurred and you don't know what's going on. Yeah, it's cool to be artistic like that for sure. After that, I've got maybe we'll listen to some vocals, because vocals to me without the proper treatment with effects, it's just I find it's a world of hurt. That's why I muted them before. To me, I don't like the sound of a natural vocal. It doesn't sound like it would if I walked into a room and someone's speaking or singing to me. You're going to get some reflections. You're going to get something happening with the room, right? So let me play that part, and that part's pretty aggressive with the vocals at the beginning, so I think it'll be a good example. So this is going to be dry, and then I'll unmute them. So they'll come back in, and what I'll do is I'll be able to mute and solo certain things so we can take a look at it.
Sure.
Let me do this. There we go. Let me dry it up. So that's with it dry. So yeah, to me again, it's all about making sure that there's still space for that to come through, but at the same time giving a little bit of help to the vocalist so that it doesn't sound completely dry, I think is appreciated on their end as well. So I'm not scared to I'm I'm not scared to put effects on, but I'm also very mindful about making sure that it's not annoying. I want it to be there, but I don't want it to be noticed too
Yes.
much.
Yeah.
So, um, I
Speaking
think,
of speaking of vocal effects, I guess there's something I'd like to point out on my end when it comes to that. So, we talked about vocals in like a general mix, but when it comes to monitors, from time to time, people ask, ask to get reverb in the monitors, and that's something I'm usually very wary about. I try to avoid as much as I can, for a couple different reasons. First off, I find that's for it helps cover up a lot of small little flaws, little details like that, and can help
yep,
you feel a bit more comfortable. But at the same time, I find that it also having too much effects or EQing or compression in your monitor mix can also um I mean make it harder for you to actually gauge what you're outputting and make you know your performance
yeah.
that I guess
I guess it masks it a little bit, right?
yeah,
Like
yeah,
it kind
it
of
does.
covers up a little bit of maybe the truth or a little bit of what would be um, considered a bit of a flaw. Yeah, no, I get what you
Yeah,
mean.
yeah, yeah, that's it. So that's actually for me something I try to avoid. Of course, when it comes to front of house, that's a different situation. But
Yeah, yeah, and I think it probably coincides because a lot of times it's funny because you start to catch these little things as you do this more and more. But oftentimes, like I'll even hear artists ask you if there's a possibility for reverb or if there's, you know what I mean, is there any reverb, whatever, and I'll
true.
actually take that cue to throw my reverb out front on in
Yeah,
the
yeah, yeah.
hopes that she'll think that that maybe not necessarily that that's coming from her wedge, but she'll then say, okay, yeah, no, that's fine. I
Mm-hmm.
inadvertently want to help myself out and also help you out.
Yeah,
I
yeah.
know that reverb's going to be a mess for her because it's going to then I'm going to pick that up and it's just going to be a, you know what I mean. We're going to be chasing each other's tails. So
Well,
a lot
exactly.
of times I'll catch those sort of things, and it's even you know it's and I guess it's hard to teach this, and it comes from experience, but even like sometimes EQing or certain things in the wedge, right? Like if it's a rockin' song and I know that he's really happy, and then I kill my front of house, and the next thing he's asking for more of this, I can't feel this, more of this. I'm like, well, I don't. It's you are going to feel this, so there's no point in asking for that stuff because I know you're going to be fine. It's sort
That's
of
right. Yeah,
knowing
yeah.
what the artist doesn't know, I guess. And
Mm-hmm.
you know, subconsciously they might not consciously know what they're asking for, but we do, right?
Yeah, no,
In
yeah.
that sense.
Too
So
much, sound, too much in general on stage can end up causing more problems than actually
yeah,
fixing them. Sometimes when you can't hear yourself properly, it's not necessarily because it's not loud enough. It might
right.
just be because there's just too much going on, and it might just be too
That's right.
loud.
Yeah, yeah. A lot of times, running monitors, I guess, is that right? Is sort of managing what they don't need,
Mm-hmm. Yep.
even if they don't know that they don't need it.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. That's right.
Yeah. No, that's cool. I think we're probably at about an hour, maybe just over an hour. So, what do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I think we could probably wrap it up. Um,
Cool.
I'm sure there's lots we could expand. Lots of stuff that we talked about. This was, a lot more of an overview, I guess. A lot of different topics. But if
Yeah.
there's anything that anyone wants us to dive in deeper on, we can definitely do that some other time.
Yeah, absolutely, man. Don't forget to subscribe. Don't forget to like, share, and comment. If you guys comment, you know, questions, comments, all of that, and hopefully, if we can gather enough of them, we can go live and we can do that sort of thing. But we'll definitely make sure that future episodes cover your guys' questions. So it's been cool, man.
Yeah, yeah, it's been
It's been
awesome.
fun. It's been a bit of out of my comfort zone. I know I
Same
can
here.
probably
Yeah,
speak for you as well,
we're
but
still kind of
I think
kind of getting the flow in, but
yeah,
no, it's pretty
yeah.
cool. It's fun to be able
No,
to actually to still do something with this whole situation that's going on. Because I mean, as most of you guys know, like our whole industry is completely stalled, right? So I think
yeah,
this
the whole world's basically on pause. So
yeah, that's it.
yeah, no, I love teaching, man. If there's one thing that I am not um, scared to do is show you guys what I do, let you guys know what I do, tell you guys, teach you. I'll whatever's in here, I'll definitely. If you guys are curious and wondering, I'll definitely speak on it. So let us know if there's anything. Yeah, and we'll do it again.
Awesome. Sounds good.
Cool.
Well,
All right. Thanks, JC. We'll see
yeah.
you guys.
See you guys next time.